We also have to remember over in Beirut, the Israeli government actually used a prominent figure over in Beirut, a warlord over there, who had been assassinated right before he was able to go over to the The Hague to witness against an Israeli leader. And we have to remember that at the same time. But the question I have for you, yourself as being a member of this independent Jewish Voices, what I can't understand is why can't basically Israel live together under one state, Israelis and Palestinians? In Canada, we're at least trying. There's many of us trying to overcome our past, keep basically the memory of the past atrocities in front of us, so that way we're not allowing them to repeat themselves. Why can't Israel do the exact same thing?
Well, I agree with that. I don't like the idea of a Jewish state any more than I like the idea of a Christian state or a Muslim state. I think there should be non-religious states. As a matter of fact, Hamas has stated a willingness to create such a state. It's my understanding that Hamas is very tolerant of diversity within Gaza, and for instance, there is the best high school in Gaza is run by the Catholic Church. But the difficulty for Israel, in terms of your question, is that Israel is determined to be a Jewish state. And so it wants, first of all, privileged status for Jews in general, and secondly, it wants all of the land from the Jordan River to the sea. That's why it has continued to occupy the West Bank and has effectively continues to occupy Gaza, even though it has, quote-unquote, withdrawn its troops. It is still in total control of Gaza, militarily, in the air, and by sea.
I have another question for you. When my wife and I were down in the United States because of my writing, I had to leave Canada for almost 5 years. There was one extremist down in the United States who basically told me, quote, right to my face, he said, if Moses would have done what God told him to be, they wouldn't be having this problem within the Middle East. And, I found that so appalling because of the fact is that, the way I look at it is that we're supposed to love each other, brother and sister. So how could someone even, claim to be a religious person and then basically say that with the next statement?
What did that mean?
Well, the way it meant, I took it as this gentleman that told me it because I know of some other actions he has said. Freedom of speech, you have freedom of speech, but then there's consequences for it. And this gentleman also believed in oppression, censorship, and even persecuting people.
No, but what did he mean about his comment about Moses?
I took it as basically, it's almost like he was saying, well, Moses should have basically gone and wiped out everyone within the state of, Israel, so that way the Israeli people could have Israel as their promised land sort of thing. That's what I took it as, and I was really appalled by that gentleman's statement. I did not support it in any way.
I understand now. There's an Israeli historian named Benny Morris who made a similar statement. He said that if Israel had effectively ethnically cleansed all of the Palestinians from Palestine in 1948, then there wouldn't be this problem today if they had finished the job. And there's an Israeli historian named Baruch Kimmerling who responded to what Benny Morris said by saying, well, if Hitler had finished the job in Europe, there wouldn't be any of this problem in Israel either. So I think it's an outrageous response to an outrageous comment.
Yeah, and what happened was that just sickened me right to the core, because this gentleman that told me it, he was a Vietnam veteran, and I looked at it going, I'm someone who believes that because I came from the Canadian military and did my time in the Canadian military, I believe that all of us that served our time in the military are a gigantic brotherhood and sisterhood, even though I do not support the ideas of war. And I also believe that all our troops should be back home where they belong. I don't believe that we should be in other lands. I believe that what we should be doing is correcting our problems here in Canada and United States, which will allow us to bring in more people and allow more people to basically to flee the war conditions that are now existing within their homelands.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your thoughts on, at this time, what is your thoughts on, how can we bring our troops home, which would basically create, and then basically reinvest in Canada and allow more people to come in?
Well, I think it's obvious to everybody that the Harper government has been determined to change Canada for the worse by emphasizing an increase in the military spending and armaments and things like this. At the same time, there's problems with funding of health care, education, and other human needs. And in parallel with that, Harper wants to curry favor with the American government, and that's why we're in Afghanistan. So if we want to address these issues, we have to change Canadian government policy, and we have to make it clear to our politicians that we don't want war-making to be the priority that the Harper government is making it. We demand that human needs in Canada be addressed with the resources in Canada.
Yeah, we also have to remember here on East Hastings is the poorest postal code within Canada, and you're seeing the out-of-control drug use, the poverty, and it's so stifling. It's unreal. And yet what happens is you're not seeing the federal government, the federal Canadian government in any way stepping in and trying to improve the situation, more housing, more social programs, more investment within the people, which would therefore allow more basically revenue to be created in the long term, because more jobs created, more taxes collected, and it'll improve Canada in the end run. So, at the same time, we also have to remember, what the question I have for you is, how do we get our federal politicians to start looking at Canada first, for all Canadian people first?
Well, I think on the model that Harper is emulating, he's emulating the United States. The United States is first and foremost in the world in terms of armaments and military spending. It dwarfs the rest of the world put together. Harper wants to emulate that, and he's been working with the military, the armaments industries and military industries to get increased expenditure on these things for Canada and to increase the size of the Canadian military. Look at the situation, the social reality in the United States. You have this number one first-class military with armaments coming out of their ears, and you have 40% of the American people who have no health care protection whatsoever. The other society in the world that is equally skewed in terms of polarity of incomes and the failing social safety net is Israel, which also has the same kind of enormous military power. Harper wants to drive Canada in the direction of Israel and the United States, those kind of priorities, where the military sucks up vast quantities of resources and social needs are increasingly neglected. If we want to put an end to that, and I think that Canadians generally do, if we're concerned about the viability of our health care and the rest of our social safety net, we have to communicate to our politicians that this has got to stop, and we have to begin using our resources to meet human needs and not the needs of the military.
We also have to remember what's happening in the First Nations at this time, especially Davis Inlet and countless other reserves are all across Canada. What we have to do is we're going to have to correct the policy that's been done by the federal government for almost ever since Canada's been in existence towards the First Nations, as treating them as a second-class citizen, almost like pieces of property that the federal government owns. We have to start treating the First Nations as equal partners, and that's what I fully advocate, is entering into equal partnership with the First Nations and non-First Nations and allowing a more equal government at the same time.
Well, it's interesting. Excuse me. It's interesting to note that South Africa modeled its apartheid regime on Canada's residential schools and reserve system. And so if you think of the connections between these things, where South African activists who are active against apartheid in South Africa are comparing Israel to South Africa unfavorably, and you think of the role that Canada had in stimulating and inspiring the creation of apartheid, all the links start to be made. We have to address apartheid in South Africa, in Israel and Palestine, and in Canada.
Well, thank you very much, Sid. It looks like we're running out of time. We're going to throw a song in and go to our next guest. Is there any last words that you'd like to share with our listening audience?
I would just urge people to become very much more aware of what's actually going on in Israel and Palestine, and to use that to meet with their members of parliament, to convince them to change their position on it, and to become involved in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns designed to pressure Israel to change its criminal behavior.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to come on. That was Sid Shniad, and this COOP Radio 102.7 FM CFRO, Monday Brown Bagger. It's January 19th. We're going to throw a quick song on, and we'll come back with our next guest.